So I have a two-part question. Is it working? My two-part question is this. Is it possible to go back to the 1950s and measure the blood levels of these stress hormones for people back at that day and age? And compare that to current. And secondarily, are there people that are sitting down right now saying, okay, we have a racist president who's increasing the amount of bigotry in America. There's a large number of activities that are increasing dramatically. How is that impacting in current day on levels in the general population, the specific populations?
Thank you. So, okay, it's on. So for the first part about tracing back to the 1950s, that would actually require having blood from that time, and I don't know that we have any data sources where we can actually get at that information at this point, unfortunately. Oh, no, it's fine. Yeah, so this is like, we wouldn't be able to do that otherwise, unless we could had samples. And so the second question, I do believe with confidence that we're going to see health changes in targeted populations. So I hope that there are people who have the funding and the resources right now who are in the midst of data collection efforts with certain populations, or might start up data collection efforts with certain populations so that we can begin to trace what's happening to them as this is happening. There was research that was done at 9/11. There was a sociologist, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, who actually looked at pre and post birth weight among Muslim women who lived in New York City, and found that the rates of low birth weight births went up dramatically post 9/11 for women who were pregnant when it happened. And so there was an immediate impact for women in the Muslim population when this happened. And so the fear of exposure to discrimination, but then this kind of escalation of hate crimes against this population played a role. And so I suspect that we might see this in a number of targeted populations that are marginalized and targeted, and with this president kind of ramping up that kind of behavior and whipping people into this frenzy, that we're going to see a lot more of these kinds of stress-related diseases. And I should say, just kind of a random note, that I know this acupuncturist who has said that his business has skyrocketed since the election. And one of the things he said was that people are coming in with headaches, lack of sleep, fatigue, they're just nausea. Right? So, I mean, and this is all stress-related stuff. So.
We have one over here. Go ahead.
Yes, could you address this phenomena of being the other as it occurs in countries that are primarily made up of immigrants? Australia, Canada, United States, Argentina. Is that phenomena of being the other in those countries similar to what is happening to the other in this country?
So other is a really broad term. I would say that if we're talking about groups who, and when you mean other, you mean like people who are marginalized or discriminated against based on their background.
Their ethnicity.
So their country of origin.
Their color.
Right. So I have a friend who does work in Australia with indigenous populations, and they are finding among indigenous children very similar results in terms of reports of poor health outcomes, and they are actually starting to, her name is Naomi Priest, and I think hopefully they'll be starting to collect biological markers on young indigenous kids in Australia, because they are a group that has spectacular rates of discriminatory acts towards them, and they're much like the indigenous population here, Native Americans in the United States, who are also experiencing horrifying levels of discrimination, who also have health profiles that are very, very bad. So yes, I say that if we look at immigrants across different populations, I would say like in France, for example, you have immigrants who are exposed to discrimination because they're not born, like North African immigrants in France or in some of these Western European countries. I suspect that we would see health differences for them as well.
I guess I'm next. I was surprised that there was no mention of the healthcare delivery system, the importance of preventive healthcare. How did that fall out of consideration here?
It didn't. It was intentional that I left it out because that is a factor that even once you account for access to health care, African Americans still have worse health profiles. I will say this, though. There has been a number of studies done in the public health literature showing the qualitative difference in health care that blacks get compared to whites, and that they are exposed to discrimination, and that doctors are even kind of trained in this idea that assuming that African Americans are inherently different in some way. So a lot of, and there's this really fascinating study that looked at observational studies where they looked at African Americans who went into the doctor and how much time the doctor actually had to treat the patient. And what they found was that when doctors were under a time crunch, they were much more likely to give African Americans worse care and the wrong diagnosis than they were white patients. Okay, and so this idea, and so in that sense, you know, inequities in health for African Americans is exacerbated by their treatment in the medical system. And so even going to the doctor for African Americans can be a stressful experience because they don't know how they're going to be treated when they go to the doctor. And so this kind of, now that's kind of a different thing than whether people have access to care, which is meaningful and important, but I don't want us to get lost in the details of healthcare access when even if they were getting the same kind of healthcare, that's not fixing the social conditions that they're in their day-to-day lives.
I also have a healthcare question. In one of your slides, I think you said that given the role that stress plays in African Americans' health, the treatments should not be colorblind. Did I remember that correctly?
What I was saying was that we have things like social safety nets that tend to be kind of race neutral. So you give people, you know, we had welfare reform, or you give people access to, you know, Head Start and things of that nature. So those are color blind. Right? And so those can help raise all ships. The problem is if your ship starts way down here and someone else's ship starts up here, raising all ships doesn't close the gap. And so what I'm saying is that when we're thinking about policy and we're thinking about ways to address situations where we have these kinds of inequalities, we have to acknowledge that just giving people money or just giving people breakfast is not going to be the thing that fixes their exposures to being harassed by the police or, you know, being excluded or kicked out of school for a minor infraction, right? So these are the kinds of things that you can't fix with a policy that doesn't acknowledge the systemic racism that plays a role.
So what is, I'm sorry to say it like this, what's the solution?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
If I'd be rich if I knew the answer. Or something. I probably wouldn't be doing this work. So I think that it's a multi-pronged issue. And so I think part of my job is to inform and educate us as a whole and as a collective of the ways in which this inequality exists so that we can't necessarily feign ignorance to knowing that it's there. One of the things that I'm also doing in the work that I'm doing is being able to show that these exposures to discrimination have very real consequences for people's biology. They have very real consequences for their health. And I think in order for us to understand and even be empathetic to the situations of other people, we have to actually acknowledge that it's not all about the individual's choice or their exposures to things. And so while I can't fix policy, and I can't fix who became president, or I can't even fix who our local, senators, our representatives are, other than voting, right? There are things that all of us can do, even in our just daily lives, that can help for people who are parts of marginalized groups. And so it's from the smallest things to the largest things, like running for office. The smallest things being, recognizing the humanity of somebody who's terrified that they're being targeted, trying to figure out what kinds of organizations you can join to help with these populations. I mean, we've got a terrified immigrant population in this city that we could be helping, right? And so there are ways that we can try to figure out on an interpersonal level what kind of contribution can we make locally to the situations that people are in, because it's not clear at this particular moment that we can rely on the lawmakers to do that. So that's going to be part of the process, right? Kind of the long-term goal. But I mean, in our day-to-day lives, I would challenge all of us to be better allies to people who are parts of these marginalized groups and figure out how we can, on our individual levels, create a collective that's effective for people.
Thank you.
So in the United States, now and in the past, Hispanics have also been the targets of racism.
Absolutely.
But their health numbers are better than the African American community. Or one could say the same thing about the Jewish community. They have been targeted. You didn't have charts about their health data, but particularly on Hispanics, what accounts for the fact that surely they have stress for being targets of racism, but their health indicators are better than the African American community.
So that's called the immigration paradox. And so this has been around for a while. So this particular paradox is about this idea that people from Central and South America have better health outcomes in the United States than African Americans. So here's the tricky part of that, right? Is it that the people who come to this country are healthier when they get here? A lot of some of the research that I've seen, population researchers have shown that the people who select into the United States, their health profiles are better. However, once you account for how long they have been in the United States, their health gets worse. So that first generation of Latinos who comes to the United States, they come here with better health. But if you measure their kids' health, and if you measure their kids' health, they look increasingly more like the US population, which means they look sicker because they actually look more healthy when they come into the United States in the first generation than whites do. But as they stay in the United States, in some ways the US makes them sick. And so it's not just about, it's not necessarily just about racism, it's also just about the lifestyle that we have in the United States that's unhealthy and exacerbates their risk. But as we get into later generations of Latinos, and these are Latinos who aren't able to pass for white. So phenotypically, they look different than whites do. That population, if we were to measure them, I suspect we would find health outcomes, kind of health profiles that look similar or closer to African Americans.
When you study these stressors, do you rank those to the different type of interactions that you have with the general part of society in your daily activity? Like obviously one that probably is out there at the top is interaction with police, but educators, the grocery store, all those other interactions, do you rank those?
So we don't rank them, but it's a fantastic question. So the study that we're doing on campus right now, we're actually measuring, the kids are basically cataloging in 15-minute blocks where they've been over the day, who they've been with, what kinds of exposures they've had. Has it been a microaggression with a teacher? Has it been with another peer? Is it with the police or something? And then ask them, do they think it's because of race or not? So they don't have to attribute it to race, but they are just documenting for us all of the things that happened to them over the course of the day. So we have not analyzed that data yet, but we have it. And that's one of the things that we're looking at with that work is what are the frequency of exposures that people have? What are the most common stressors that they experience on the UNL campus and in their kind of day-to-day lives that might be shaping their health profiles? But yeah, in terms of stressors for Black males in particular, being pulled over by the police tends to be one. But now if we were to ask the question of people who are of Latino descent, for them it would be seeing an ICE, or law enforcement agent coming near them would be kind of terrifying, because it doesn't matter if you were born in the United States or not. If you look like you might not have been born in the United States, this could be a factor. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to kind of map out and see what people are exposed to and how they're responding to it.
I have a question over here. I understand why you focused on mortality and major diseases for the study you're doing, but it would seem to me that there'd be all kinds of other effects on young people in particular. For example, I would think had to be a really good student if you were feeling threatened by microaggression and things. Do you care to speculate on that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you?
What other effects does this day-by-day discrimination have on the health of people besides major diseases?
So it's about the risk. So yeah, there are other issues that can happen. You can see grades suffer for being exposed. If we're talking about students, their grades can suffer. Feelings of isolation may increase. Elevated levels of anxiety and depression. This can create challenges for their ability to do their work. There are lots of different effects, but my interest and my expertise is in these chronic disease risks, because that's what I'm interested in. And so while there are lots of people studying all of these other kinds of factors, psychological, academic, interpersonal kinds of outcomes, that's not my area. So we all kind of have our specialties that we do. And so for me, and part of that is personal, because I come from a family where I have lost a number of family members to a number of these diseases at early ages. And it maps on to a study that just came out by Dr. Deborah Umberson at UT and her colleagues that found that African Americans are more likely to lose family members by the time they hit 50 years of age than other populations. So they've lost a tremendous number of family members to any number of health-related risks and conditions, and that in and of itself is a public health issue in this particular population, and one that's very important. So.
Well, you mentioned something about subconscious racism, and it might be that sometimes people with really good intentions say something that is perceived as a microaggression. And it might be instructive for us if you could talk a little bit more about that and give us some examples.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great question. So that is called implicit bias. So implicit bias is a person's kind of unconscious bias that they have, right? So it's not something that they're consciously aware of. So implicit bias, there have been some interesting experimental studies that have come out of psychology around implicit bias. And if you're interested, Harvard actually has an online, it's called Project Implicit, where you can go online and you can take an implicit bias test. So if you just Google implicit bias Harvard, you'll be able to go and do this kind of exercise where they're literally able to measure your implicit bias. And so what's important about this is that we live in a society that's not divorced from inequality and racism. So we are inundated with these images on a daily basis. And so subconsciously, we may carry some of these biases with us. And so when it comes to African Americans and certain populations, so here's like it may seem benign, but for people of Asian descent, when someone someone says to you, "Where are you from?" and you say, "I'm from Detroit," and then they say, "Where are you really from?" That is a microaggression. That is a microaggression. Or if you're a tenure-track faculty African-American male or female, and a white female or male comes up to you and says, "You're working too hard," that can be a kind of subtle form of, we don't want you overperforming, which can also be a type of subtle microaggression. So one of the things that's been interesting to come out of psychology is they've been able to do some kind of experimental studies where they have these kind of, so they have certain groups of people from the majority group and then people from a minority group. And so people from the majority group, so whites, would engage in a sort of subtle microaggression. And then they'd have a control group where a person was just having a regular interpersonal interaction. And what they found was that African Americans can very, very accurately perceive when they're being microaggressed against. So people say, well, you may be overreacting, you may be, but they're able to actually show that African Americans can read that. They know when it's happening to them. And so when you've got this experimental design to actually show that this is a person with intent and does it, this scripted thing, that it matters. And so here's another important example of implicit bias. So Philip Goff, I can't remember what university he's at, but he's a social psychologist who's done a lot of work in implicit bias and dehumanization. This is the act of denying a person their humanity. And what he's found in his studies is that African Americans implicitly are more likely to be, and this is like among police officers. Don't tell me, I don't know how he was able to get in to measure police officers. It's amazing. But he was able to show in a sample of police officers that they are more likely to perceive an African American child as older than their age, but yet at the same time, they should be more responsible for their actions. They perceived African Americans as being more animalistic and ape-like. And this is all kind of coming out of their subconscious, that they're able to find this kind of, and his name is Philip Goff. If you're interested in any of his work, it's absolutely extraordinary, Goff. He's done some extraordinary work in this area. And so these are really kind of important things to keep in mind, is that sometimes it's just not even conscious. It's just part of the fabric. I told some of you at the break, this is just the fabric of our culture. Like, this is something that's ingrained from the conception of this country. And so this is something that is a very real issue that we need to be having very candid conversations about, because it does affect our behavior and our interactions with people who don't look like us.
Has anybody done any or been able to do any studies on how all of this stress affects the epigenetics? We tend to say that African Americans have, or quotes, genetically more hypertensive or diabetic or whatever, but if we go backwards and look at the stress that African Americans have always had, has that stress changed the epigenetics, which then sort of ingrains itself into the genetics? Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, so epigenetics came up multiple times, and so I'm happy to have a conversation about it. So for those of you who aren't aware of what epigenetics is from kind of a simple level, it's basically the fact that our body is made up of genes that are constantly turning on and off. While we're talking right now, we've got genes in our brains that are turning on and switching on and off. So we have these strands in our DNA that are associated with different characteristics. And depending on the environment, this is about our bodies interacting with the environment. Depending on the environment that we're in, certain genes may flip on, but certain genes may turn off. And so what this question is really about is there's this theory theory called the fetal origins hypothesis. And this comes out of data from the Great Hunger winter during World War II, where the Dutch famine happened when Hitler basically shut off all of the boundaries around Holland, and people starved. And so depending on where women were in their pregnancies, their offspring and their offspring's offspring were at a higher risk for being exposed to chronic disease risks like type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and all of these things were, they found, related to basically the stress was caloric restriction, right? And so that's a pretty extreme example and a very clean-cut example of epigenetics. It's more complicated for African Americans. So epigenetics, again, yes, absolutely can play a role. I had a figure that I had earlier in the talk that I just glossed over that was basically showing the epigenetic pathway potentially for African Americans. And basically, the top is prenatal stress in utero. What that can do is that can shape the fetal environment, which can induce changes in the fetus's physiology. And that's part of the epigenetic process. This is the body saying, oh no, the mother is experiencing stress. We need to figure out how to create a profile of health for the fetus that can prepare it for the stressful life conditions it's going to have outside the womb. What that means is, though, potentially when you're dealing with stress-related conditions, that the fetus is not going to be able to metabolize fat in the same way, in a healthier way. They may be more because of this concern around stress and the available energy that they need in order to deal with stress. And these kinds of conditions around blood pressure, all of these things can be elevated in risk because of the in utero exposure to stress. Now, that is not to say that these are immutable changes. And this is not to say that every single African American who has a mother who experiences stress is going to have hypertension when they grow up, because there are a whole lot of other factors that are going to go into that, including how they grow up, where they grow up, their own predispositions, how they cope with stress, right? So these things are not completely immutable, but epigenetics absolutely can play a role in shifting the risk higher for certain groups when it comes to these kinds of conditions. There's somebody back there. Sherry, there's somebody back there who's been waiting.
I wanted to ask, just personally, like what you want to study in the future, like what's next and what's after that, and yeah.
So I'm right in the midst of a brand new study. So this study where we're collecting, I told you we're collecting data on the kids' environments that they're in right now at UNL. But what I didn't say was that we have them wearing these ambulatory monitors. And these monitors measure sympathetic nervous system arousal. And so I told you that the cardiovascular system is related to sympathetic nervous system arousal. These monitors, which they were just developed by MIT, and they've only really been used in clinical settings to trace epileptics, kind of follow epileptics. We're using out in the field to measure how people are responding as they're experiencing stress, the stress of discrimination. Because one of the things that I'm interested in I've always been interested since I've gotten into the biosocial research, but primarily becoming more interested in is how the body responds and adapts to stress. How does the process through which, because what I talked about here was the accumulation of stress for disease risk. I want to know about that process to how people get there. So part of that process is this kind of constant response to exposures to discrimination as it's happening. And so the future of the work that I'm doing with the folks in my lab is really to try to understand dynamically how, as people experience the stress of things like discrimination, is it shaping their response right then and there? What is their body doing as it's happening? Is their heart rate going up? Are they showing sympathetic arousal, which is measured at stress arousal, right? So nobody's ever really done this before. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at, is just kind of how do we do this on a moment by moment level so that we can then say, see, we're showing you what literally literally is happening in a person's body as they're experiencing this stress. And so our goal is to really be able to take that and map it onto these kinds of risks that we see later in these markers biologically that we measure later in blood and things like that.
You had a chart showing that the high levels of racist stress and high levels of poor health were not in the Deep South, not in the area of slavery and Jim Crow laws, but actually the highest levels were in Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, et cetera. Could you speak to that, if I understood that chart correctly?
Actually, no, that's not what my chart said. That's the opposite. No. Was this the map?
Yes.
Yeah. No,
and was the red, what is the red?
So the red is greater than 0.5 standard deviations among the mean for health. So these are the highest rates, but this entire area here is racism, but at different gradations. So the highest rates are in Louisiana. So there are parts of the Jim Crow South where this is an issue. Mississippi, Alabama, as you go up the map, right? So then you see this kind of concentration up here as well. But the orange is also still high rates of racism, just not as high as the red. So there is more of a spread than that. But this is just one particular kind of indicator here. And so yeah, so there's a little bit more of a spread here.
I have a question about your study that you're doing. Mm-hmm. Are you also screening the subjects of your study by family income as one of the factors as well? Because you were making a distinction between those from households of greater than 175,000?
Yeah, that was just a study that was looking at high income, like wealthy.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Are you looking at the high income students of African American descent that are in your study, as well as those that are not high income?
No, so that's not the focus of this particular study, and we're not going to see a lot of variation on that particular measure, and our sample size is going to be way too small to be able to compare across income within a racial ethnic group. So we would not be able to tap into that. However, African Americans and other students of color that are able to make it to college are a unique population in and of themselves. And so regardless of whether they're high income or not, they are still a unique population. And so it's a land-grant university, so it's unlikely we're going to get really wealthy kids of any kind of group at this point, but, because they're going to go to the private schools. But in particular, you're not going to see a lot of the variation in this population that we would need for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think in your slide on light at the end of the tunnel or something like that, you indicated that there might be a useful direction in addressing racism directly. You mentioned a couple of things that people can do individually in terms of daily interactions and behaviors. Do you have any policy sorts of suggestions that might deal with that racism minimization?
Yeesh. Well, I may have recommendations, but nobody's going to listen to them. I mean, to be quite frank and honest, this is such a complicated issue, and how do you change people's attitudes? And ultimately, and I showed you that chart of Uber discrimination, how it's coming in from all of these different systems and feeding into it and perpetuating and exacerbating it. And so unless there was some sort of political will to stop the enormous gradients of income inequality in this country and the concentrations of wealth at the absolute top end of the spectrum and everybody else being left behind, it's not clear that we can do anything about particular groups who are in danger at this point. We're already seeing all of the work that was done in the 60s, really those were just stopgap policies that never were followed up on. So, you can integrate schools, but we figured out, we now now have we figured out how to unintegrate, stop that. And it's been reversed. So people have the option of moving out of neighborhoods, and they do. If we could try to figure out how to have incentives for people to live in more mixed neighborhoods by income and race, and those tend to not be attractive to people, and we're individualistic and don't want policies telling us what to do or dictating our attitudes. But as I was telling some people earlier, that we need the kinds of structured policies that are race specific should be giving people a nudge in the direction of kind of rewarding integration and rewarding. And so, this whole idea of, quote, diversity of people, bringing in people of color into different positions of leadership or into universities and things like that, that can't necessarily stop the problem if we don't address the systemic issues. So you want more African American or minority professors of color to come to the university. Well, you got to have a pipeline for that. And that means that all of these kids that are growing up in these segregated, poor neighborhoods, they're not going to have that chance. And so until we can kind of figure out how to address these things at a systemic level, and that's just so huge. That's why I have to keep it small scale, because it's not clear to me how we're going to get there, particularly if you think about the kind of rhetoric we have right now. I think that where our agency and power lies is more at the local levels. I think that's where we're going to see the change happen. We can't really affect the federal government in any sort of meaningful way right at this moment, but we can affect what happens in our environments, and if we have enough of a will to do that.
There have been a number of books written looking at Donald Trump supporters, indicating that they feel like they have been picked on, that they have been discriminated against, the politics of resentment. Is there any reason to think that Donald Trump supporters of that sort are not going to be experiencing the same physiological problems because of their feelings?
That is a just brilliant question. Wow. Yeah, no, in all seriousness, it has to be stressful, even if it's not really happening to you, to constantly wake up every morning feeling like you're being attacked, and feeling like you're getting screwed, and feeling like somebody else is taking something from you. And so absolutely that's going to be stressful, and absolutely they're going to have the kind of health profiles that manifest in the kind of stress that they're experiencing. And so I hope that there's somebody that studies this population, because I think that would be a fascinating study.
So can we say that Fox News is a major medical problem in America?
It is a significant stressor.
One of the health things I think have been interesting to me is the rising mortality rate of middle-aged white males. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if this is an illustration of what you're talking about just now.
Actually, no, I think it's a different mechanism. So I think, I guess it's a related mechanism. So the study that I showed you briefly that I just published with a colleague of mine at South Carolina, we actually found that while for African Americans, socioeconomic status did not explain cardiovascular disease risks. So like being poor and moving up into middle class in adulthood did not protect African Americans' health. But for example, white women, it was protective. So white women who went from poverty to being middle class in adulthood were healthier than white women who were just poor across the board. So there was this effect of protection. Now, what we did find, which was really interesting, is that for white males who went from poverty to middle class in adulthood, they actually had worse cardiovascular risk than both white women and poor white men. And so one of the things that we argue is what potentially is going on here is the just sheer stress and challenge of moving to be socially mobile in the United States. It is so extraordinarily, our country is wrapped up in this kind of masculinity that can be extraordinarily stressful for white men to kind of move up. And we know it's getting harder and harder to be economically mobile anyway, right? So it's become it's extraordinarily difficult to move up the ladder. And for white men who succeed at doing that, there's a cost involved in it because of the stress that they experience and because of like kind of politics of masculinity and the lack of support for men as they're moving up the socioeconomic ladder. And we're trying to dig more deeply into what all of that really means. But I think that it's important. I think it's actually an interesting and important finding that we found that these men who moved up from poverty into middle class, there's some sort of sacrifice that they're making in order to get there. And maybe some of that might have to do with this idea of kind of bias by class, but I'm thinking more along the lines that it's just the cost involved for them to move up and how much stress it takes to make it to that next economic echelon for white men. And they are also coming from a different health profile than African Americans and a different kind of background from African Americans as well.
Early in your presentation, you showed a map of the United States and the location of hate groups across the country, and I thought I saw two or three marks in Nebraska.
Yes,
Any
sir.
idea what those entities were?
I don't know specifically what they are.
You can get them from the Southern Law.
That's right. So this is the Southern Poverty Law Center. If you want to know more about the details of this map and the locations of each of the hate groups, they have all of this. This is an interactive map. I'm just giving you the screenshot. Who's that?
Gerhard Lauk.
Okay. Gerhard Lauk. Gotcha.
Yeah. Do you find secondary effects of the stress? I'm thinking in terms of people who recognize early deaths in their family and in their associates saying, well, I'm doomed to an early life or short life, and maybe I can make less good decisions about diet or exercise or behavior because I'm doomed to that anyway as a result of the stress?
Yeah, I don't study that per se, but I think that hopelessness across the board has been shown to be related to a number of different health risk behaviors and declines because it's associated with, depression and people's abilities to actually navigate and cope in a healthy way can be compromised when they feel hopeless. And so this is one of these issues that comes up for African Americans living in inner cities and stuff, is that those who are hopeless or who don't believe that they're going to live to be a certain age tend to have greater challenges in their lives while it's happening. And so I think that becomes this idea of hope is pretty essential to help people to cope in a healthy way when they're dealing with adversity. But yeah, it can be a factor. But I think a lot of people are actually remarkably resilient in the face of tremendous adversity.
I'm interested in the structure underlying the sample that went into the previous slide. I noticed that
this one?
No, the one on the distribution of the map.
Gotcha.
Have you comment on the area around Detroit is understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Is that Buffalo, Detroit, but the Upper Peninsula of Michigan?
Oh yeah.
What is
high concentration of hate groups?
Oh, it's hate groups driving that.
No, not this map. No, so this is about kind of racist racial climate.
Yeah, this is as a proportion of Google queries.
Yes, so Google queries.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about, is what's the sample structure in this?
Right, they used...
is it two people sitting at their keyboard 27 hours a day banging on it? Spewing out
now, I don't know.
Hate.
So all I can tell you, it's been a while since I read the article, but all I can tell you is that they have Nielsen household data. So they've got the kind of marketing data. So they've sampled, they mapped onto this guy. So Google gave them this kind of private data that has information on searches, and they kind of map that onto regions based on these advertising regions. And so I can't tell you what kind of sample they've got across these different regions. It's based on how Nielsen actually sampled for advertise or whatever the advertising company was, had it broken out into these different regions based on advertising. And so they were able to merge these two data sets in order to get information on their sample. So it's a complicated sampling strategy, and I just don't know enough about this study.
Is there anyone who has not been able to ask a question yet?
He'll we'll give you one for each hand.
I found your thoughts about the 2004 election really interesting. Do you recall if those took into account the gerrymandering so predominant in the South? There's been a lot of study of the 2004 election. I've been really curious. I really haven't looked into this, but you know, the South was simply re-gerrymandered after the 2010 election. But the few people who know a lot about this stuff that I've inquired about this, they don't think there was any evident gerrymandering in the 2016 election. And I just I can't accept that.
I mean, there was like a paper that just came out about that like 2 or 3 days ago that actually demonstrated that absolutely gerrymandering played a role in this election.
That's what I thought.
So it just takes time for that to get published,
Yeah.
but there was absolutely a study that just came out. UC San Diego, the scholars were from UC San Diego who just released that study.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any hands, so we should thank our speaker.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.